Good evening everyone, Malcolm Noble welcoming you to the fourth in a series of talks about the history of English detective fiction. And tonight I want to discuss The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, but I'm not going to review this Agatha Christie classic, pointing out its highlights and its difficulties. I'd rather come at it by discussing it as a milestone in crime writing and how it contributed to the genre. Now, just a reminder, these talks are not a chronology or an A to Z, so although you can go back and catch the first 3 episodes, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't start with this talk and then explore the others at a later date. Now, this Agatha Christie classic is famous for 2 things: whodunit and how the author concealed the solution to the mystery. And I'm going to try and get through this evening's talk without disclosing either, so hopefully there will be no spoilers, and if you've not read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I hope that after this podcast you'll go ahead and read a copy. The book was published in the spring of 1926. It was Agatha Christie's 7th book and her 6th novel, the first one to be published by Collins. They gave it a rather uninspiring dust wrapper and an initial print run of 5,000 copies. The early press reviews were lukewarm to say the least, and it can be read as a fairly pedestrian story, apart of course from its surprise ending. As soon as the book began to gain traction, it was quickly adapted as a play, Alibi, in 1928, and was first filmed in 1931. It has of course subsequently been adapted for the television. Without doubt, it established Agatha Christie's reputation. Like Murder on the Orient Express and Then There Were None, it is one of those Christie's titles which is often cited by many people who've never read the book. What set it apart, of course, was the surprise ending. Many people suggest that this was put forward by Lord Louis Mountbatten, and certainly Agatha Christie did acknowledge his suggestion, but the idea had already been floated by Christie's brother-in-law, and she had used a sort of similar trick in The Man in the Brown Suit. Such was the book's standing that 20 years after its publication, when Edmund Wilson wrote a series of articles criticising detective fiction, he called one of the essays "Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?" A rather silly question, since by that time hundreds of thousands of people had shown that they cared enough to put their hands in their pockets and spend a few pence in order to find out. Then more recently we've had the book "Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?", where the evidence against Christie's perpetrator is re-examined. I first read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in an old Oddham's omnibus. I was on an evening train journey between Winchester and Fareham in Hampshire, England. It was in one of those isolated compartments of the old rickety type trains where there was polished timber, itchy, dusty upholstery, and a heating system that seemed determined to choke you to death. Outside it was dark, with the shadows of the trees and houses passing by in one of my favourite bits of countryside. But of course the journey wasn't long enough for me to finish the book, and I had to carry on reading it in my digs. At the time I was lodging in the attic of a well-to-do house on the edge of Winchester City. Not quite a country house, but certainly substantial enough to give me the right feel for an Agatha Christie in the middle of the night. I've often said that you can tell a good detective story because it remains a joy to read even when you know who done it. And this is certainly the case with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's lovely to read it again, knowing what the answer is, and smiling to ourselves as we see how Agatha Christie tricked us all. But was it really a trick? The first thing to recognise is that Christie did not hide the perpetrator away. They, and I shall use the neutral term they to disguise whether it is a he or a she, for those of you who haven't yet read the book. They are on the stage. They are barefaced and offer no disguise. If there is a disguise, it's Christie's surrounding the perpetrator with colourful and more attractive suspects. There are people there that we want to be the murderer. If you like, the perpetrator is disguised by their own ordinariness. A second thing to mark out is that early on, Christie devoted nearly a whole chapter to describing the setting of the mystery. So we are given a small town, I always think of it as the Cotswolds, peopled by all the characters that we would expect to find in an English detective story. Christie has fooled us to expect a conventional detective story where even if we do not guess the perpetrator, we expect the solution to be one of our alternative suspects. How clever. So what was all the fuss about? Now, I think with all these years that have passed, we need to be careful when we talk about the controversy that Roger Ackroyd promoted. Certainly, one reader did write a letter to the Times complaining about Agatha Christie's methods, and if that's the barometer of a national talking point, so be it. But with hindsight now, I think it's difficult to assess just how much of this controversy is actually a myth that has built around the title. But I want to say that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was not in itself a groundbreaking book. It was successful, and my word it was, because the readership were waiting for it. In a previous podcast, I pointed out that A. Milne's The Red House Mystery included an author's preface where he suggested certain rules for a detective story, and then in the mystery he went on to explore those conventions. By the time that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd came along, only a few years later, those conventions were so embedded that the readers were ready to applaud the impertinence of someone who could test the rules to breaking point. Who cared who killed Roger Ackroyd? While all those readers who were delighted to see that although the English detective novel had fairly tight and constricting boundaries, those rules could be explored in an imaginative and rather cheeky way. The notion of fair play was so embedded that when the Detective Club opened its doors in 1930, the authors swore allegiance to the set of rules with their tongues firmly in their cheek. In fact, the ceremony was all a bit of a nonsense. When it came to ingenuity, from now on, detective writers could push against an open door. If The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was a milestone because it showed how much and how quickly the readership had matured and was able to respond with some sophistication, it also secured Agatha Christie's place on our bookcases, as she was a sufficiently prominent author that when she disappeared in a couple of years' time, it could fairly be front page news. From now on, we expected a Christie for Christmas, and we expected the unexpected. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the fourth in a series of podcasts about the history of English detective fiction from 1920 to about 1960. My name is Malcolm Noble. My website is malcolmnoble.com. I hope that you'll take a look at it. I uploaded this podcast on the 4th of December. The next one is due on the 18th, and I expect to be talking about the growth of the circulating libraries which supported crime fiction during the Golden Age, although of course I may change my mind in the meantime. Thank you to Freeze Effects for the royalty-free music, and all that remains is for me to wish you a very good night, and God bless.